Genshin has undoubtedly progressed its story in a way that things we thought were disconnected are now falling into place. Before, we constantly meme on the Traveler as a protagonist that only runs errands region after region, doing their respective archons massive favors in exchange of a disproportionate crumb of clue that barely leads them to their sibling. But it all changed when they ventured to Sumeru, the land of the Dendro Archon and the Nation of Wisdom. While there was no dispute that Sumeru was one of Genshin's peaks, it truly did deliver with an insight that plants a new seed of narrative significance for the Traveler, that they are the fourth Descender. Fourth, Nahida herself had no prior information about topics regarding Descenders, but in a negotiation to hand over the Dendro and Electro Gnosis to Dottore, she was awakened to the knowledge that the sky is fake. Following this, she was made aware that the Heavenly Principles were the first ever Descender. Fast forward to now, with Notcry and its new major book in Hymns of the Far North, we were able to discover the identity of one of these Descenders, that being Saralainen, the third Descender, whose remains were carved into 7 pieces that make up the Gnosis after an unfortunate intervention fell upon him for attempting to open the gates of Pohjola. But despite these revelations, what do we really know of the Descenders, apart from the fact that they are outlanders that could transcend the laws of Teyvat? Even in the new looming threat that Dottore poses over Notcry, what lies beyond the attempts to theorize that he aims to become a Descender himself? This was one of the recent anticipated theories among the lore videos I watched, credits to Minsleif, but I do not claim to smear dirt into these findings. I am, though, skeptical of why we just make a big deal out of the term Descender when all we know about them is that they could transcend Teyvat's fate. Sometime in the past month, I made a poll asking you about your thoughts regarding the Descender logic. And in this video, I will probe into questions such as, why is such a term so important? And why do we need to care about Descenders from a lore perspective? I'm Mercanique, and join me as I put the lore in Explore. We first heard this term during the climax of the Sumeru Archon quest, following Dottore's ambush and the major negotiation that prompted him to remove all of his segments. Apart from the information that the sky is fake, Nahida also mentioned to familiarize herself with the seeming catalog on the subject matter of Descenders. As of now, we have the Heavenly Principles as the first, Saralainen being the third, and the Traveler being the fourth. The second is still unconfirmed at this point, but people have been speculating that it could be Nibelung, while another suggestion would be that it's the Voyager Sutervoinen. The grounds for identifying a Descender is often confused to those who aren't. It simply goes by saying that all Descenders are Outlanders, but not all Outlanders are Descenders. So we find ourselves in the process of elimination given all the criteria we know. Prominent among these are their missing records in Irminsul, which indicates that they do not belong to Teyvat, and their independent power that stands unaffected by the ruling entity, with such being the Heavenly Principles. The problem is, these can be quite vague, as the only reliable method we could have to know if an Outlander does or does not belong to Teyvat is if it's explicitly stated that the Irminsul possesses records of them. Both Sutervoinen and Nibelung would definitely fit the initial notion of not belonging to Teyvat, due to their own respective origins and just the mere lack of mention that could imply that the Irminsul records them. In fact, I believe that the reason why people may be inclined to consider Nibelung to be the second Descender is because there are closer implications to him not being recorded by Irminsul, given how most texts that involve the dragons throughout Natlan are often displayed in obfuscation. But even that is a loose association. So what exactly is the point of knowing who the Descenders are? Specifically, given the Traveler plays the protagonist role in the progression of the story, what significance could there be in the knowledge that they can transcend fate? I think the better approach to this problem is not with how the world of Teyvat perceives these Descenders, but rather with how the arrival of these Descenders shifted the history of Teyvat. Besides, there are only a few groups of people who ever use the term descender, and I argue that it matters more to our current distinctions of such in comparison to normal outlanders. So to start with, considering the identities of the descenders we know, we could tie with them history-sensitive objects, concepts, and timeframes based on their presence in the overall timeline. We have the heavenly principles, who time after time has been emphasized to disrupt the natural order of the world. Their arrival followed the creation of the Shades, whose domains still persist in varying influence in different parts of the Seven. It is also due to their presence that Nibelung was urged to defend his territory, and got pushed into a grave decision to introduce the Abyss for a chance of vengeance, to which he and his kin were handled failures by the descent of the Celestial Nails. We have Saaralainen, who was dispatched by the Belitar on a mission to open the gates of Pohjola. But in doing so, they got apprehended by the heavenly principles and in collaboration with the one who came after, created the Gnosis out of his remains. These Gnosis were the catalysts for a major era that determined the dominionship of the Seven, a long-running worldwide period of conflict for said treasures, named the Archon War. And when the Seven Nations were established, the Eighth arose, an underground kingdom that never had any god but still thrived in their own very human capability, the Kingdom of khaenri'ah, with its original dynasty flourishing in reverence of the reflection of one of the fallen moons after they too got destroyed as a collateral of the War of Vengeance, with Nibelung turning them into weapons. However, they did not last long, as they eventually were forced to live under persecution of the following Eclipse dynasty. This new age of khaenri'ah led them to a further pursuit of prosperity that soon reached incomprehensible bounds as they were lulled and grew fond of the power of the Abyss. It was not long until another looming disaster followed by the judgment of the heavens came as the cataclysm destroyed khaenri'ah and became a focal crossroad that sets the main familiar story we have in motion. Around this sequence of events, the Traveler and their twin try to flee Teyvat, and this time they are apprehended not by the heavenly principles, but Asmoday, the Shade of Space and the proclaimed sustainer of the heavenly principles. The Shade separated the two 500 years apart, and we began the story from the perspective of the Traveler, having to meet Paimon and slowly learning about the truth behind their sibling as the heir of khaenri'ah's kingdom and the Abyss Order. In this brief recounting of Teyvat's history, we see an underlying pattern that reveals something odd. We know that throughout the Traveler's journey across the Seven, it is constantly emphasized that the heavenly principles is asleep. I recall the last time we had them was during the apprehension of Saaralainen that resulted in the creation of the Gnosis. How come they disappeared, and later in history, half the Shades take part in the cataclysm and in apprehending the twins as they leave? What lies beyond the gates of Pohjola that consequently had Saaralainen be sliced apart into 7 divine pieces? Where did Paimon come from, and why was the sibling not considered a descender? I'm not here to make theories, but this just suggests that throughout Teyvat's history, descenders were involved in some degree of separation, and I do think that this separation is done out of a certain necessity. If you think about it, the heavenly principles could have fallen asleep earlier as soon as they defeated Nibelung in their first clash. The heavenly principles could have fallen asleep after casting down the celestial nails to quell the abyssal calamities that the vengeful dragons have brought. But why did their slumber look like an occurrence, an opportunity that archons of the present world use to somewhat align with some grand plan orchestrated by the Tsaritsa? Yes, it is a plausible conclusion that the Tsaritsa aims to seize the Gnosis to piece her beloved back together, but the Gnosis, with all their divine components and importance in the story, seem to be all too vital for the necessity of separation. Did you remember when Dottore negotiated with Nahida in regards to sharing information in exchange for both the Dendro and Electro Gnosis? There was a point where Nahida threatened Dottore to destroy a Gnosis in an arbitrary chance to awaken the heavenly principles. Focalors had to tiptoe around her deceptive plan of returning the original throne of Hydro to Neuvillette, with the consideration that the Hydronosis was the one powering the Oratrice Mécanique d'Analyse Cardinale. Mawika at some point hesitated with the Pyronosis and still uses it as part of her plan in Natlan's war against the Abyss despite the ideological clash with Capitano. These are instances that could suggest that the Heavenly Principle's slumber had strong connections with the significance of these gnosis, and I believe that Sadalinen's apprehension was also part of this plan. Could the plan be indirectly implying the importance of Pohjola as some top-secret Teyvat location, that the apprehension is warranted for a perceived contest between two descenders? There sure are wars fought amongst gods and humans, but this wouldn't raise a possibility that there is war amongst descenders. But I think Pohjola contains a power that, if it were to at least be discovered by another descender, the fate of Teyvat could be something more for better or for worse. Sutervoinen did foresee an inevitable destruction for Teyvat that Nibelung scoffed at out of hubris. When Alice shared about the bygone times when the Three Moon Goddesses were still controlling the laws of Teyvat, she mentioned that the Three Moon Goddesses split these powers amongst themselves out of the promise to never consolidate them into a singular body. Doing so would keep the world stable. And with the trilunar syzygy causing disturbances in Teyvat's borders, this became a major concern for Alice and the Hexenzirkel, so much so that the Merry Witch herself is indifferent to the matters with the Heavenly Principles. So I don't think that the Heavenly Principles covets whatever power lies past the gates of Pohjola. If by any chance Pohjola happens to be Celestia, therefore contradicting the landscape descriptions within Hymns of the Far North, then it makes sense for the Heavenly Principles to punish any attempting trespassers. In fact, I do think that the Heavenly Principles is keeping anyone away from Pohjola as to not present a possibility of triggering the same instability that the Moon Goddesses have been steering the world away from, which is also the possible threat that the trilunar syzygy poses. If we go from this same logic, referencing what Alice said about the Moon Goddesses vowing to share Teyvat's primordial laws amongst each other to avoid a singular consolidation, then it makes sense for the Heavenly Principles not to let anyone powerful enough to transcend fate to get their hands onto such power. But it's not like Sadalainen willed it himself. After all, he was only sent there as a condition to earn the hand of the Beli-Tar's daughter. So from the beginning, it was rather the Beli-Tar's desire to go after what's within Pohjola. And what drove him to do this? Well, upon closer thought, I have come to realize that whatever sparked the Beli-Tar's motives towards certain various things, it's probably not enough to account his experiences of loss for accidentally killing his younger brother. No, I believe it could be something more, knowing that the Beli-Tar was not one without people who influenced him. And among these people lies one who may as well give us clarity in regards to the timeline, with a puzzle piece that introduces more substance to the term Descender. From there, we might also stumble upon a core part of the ideological DNA of the Fatui that may or may not have factored into Dottore's motive and obsession towards his goal as of present, now that he actively seeks the Three Moons for himself. With all that was brought up, the Fatui, the trilunar syzygy, the destruction of Teyvat as Sutervoinen has foreseen, and the Descender's necessity for separation, this one person might reveal that an attempt at consolidating the world will always end up in catastrophic downfall of everything and anything. Would you believe me if I say that khaenri'ah is older than the Seven? At first, it confused me, because I always knew that they rose at some time during or after the Archon War. But even if we take into account the stories within Perinheri, there was no clear definitive timeline of when khaenri'ah was established. It did, however, suggest that khaenri'ah was already thriving even before the Archon War began. We knew that Khaenri'ah history was divided into eras belonging to two dynasties, and the setting of Perinheri suggested that from an unknown length of time until the establishment of the Seven Nations post-Archon War, Khaenri'ah was under the Crimson Moon dynasty. The sages once had a ceremony that made children whom they welcome into their orphanage crawl up a fireplace in an attempt to have them see a crimson moon. This was done in anticipation of the arrival of beings who could transcend the gods. This sounded familiar. Yes, it is the exact notion that separates descenders apart from regular outlanders. Perhaps this was why the sages also accepted any outsiders and those who were not from the kingdom. This became their sort of criteria that proceeded further means to classify a descender. But while Perinheri died, was able to see the crimson moon and thus reborn, it seemed that the sages never got to witness the arrival of such a transcendental being, and it was only a matter of time before the Eclipse dynasty took over. This in itself was neither a breakthrough or an utter failure. The sages still managed to produce great knights who would serve the kingdom, but the greater contributor, I think, was the foundation for the various definitions of descenders. Initially, we were only introduced to the term thanks to Nahida, but Nahida wasn't aware of such a term, and she herself mentioned that it's a method of classification used by the fatui to distinguish those who do not belong to Teyvat. And while the fatui considers this an exclusive information, perhaps due to its adjacent themes to their main agenda, they were probably just among the group of people who actively use such a term, especially in relation to the traveler. The key thing to bring up is that some harbingers or key figures of the fatui were at some point citizens or descendants of khaenri'ah. For instance, we could look at Piero, Capitano, and Arlecchino. With Piero's position as the director of the fatui, it would be a surprise if it was he who brought knowledge about descenders, considering that he was once a royal mage under the Eclipse dynasty. Now, going back to the timeline, the Archon War is a reference point in time that is most debatable in regards to the major pivots in khaenri'ah. I had an initial thought that maybe the Belitar already knew about the Descenders and used this knowledge to manipulate Saarelainen into opening the gates of Pohjola for his own ends. But for what? The thought of rebelling against the heavenly principles never crossed his mind yet at the time. At least from what I recall, it was only when he took in a certain mad monk named rauthvangi was he influenced with the idea of such rebellion. Rauthvangi was just a novice monk in the Universitas Magistrorum, yet he developed an obsession over a pitch-black Elysium upon catching a glimpse of it in a mirror. This caused him to be expelled and exiled upon further fascination, but found himself within the trusted circles of the Belitar. The Belitar at some point also developed a desire to search for a way to create an Elysium, much to the influence of Rauthvangi, which might have subsequently propelled him to entertain the idea of rebellion against the established heavenly order. Though I am unsure as to how he was influenced so strongly. But recounts of Rauthvangi earning his way to be the Tsar's favorite with stories of surviving a poisoning from his rival and summoning the soul of a noble's deceased wife made me think that he was able to appeal to the Tsar's grief over the loss of his brother, that maybe he might know of a way to bring his brother back. And so that brings the timeline into question that if we use the Archon War as a reference point in time, when did Rauthvangi venture to Snezhnaya and become part of the Tsar's court? If this could be answered, we should be able to get an idea on how khaenri'ah transitioned from the Crimson Moon dynasty to the Eclipse dynasty. As we knew from Night of the Sky's unveiling that Rauthvangi also had the blood of Outlanders, could he have been an important piece in the puzzle that inches us closer to the truth of Pohjola and Saarelainen? Then at least, I believe I might have grasped a possible chronology that could explain Rauthvangi's significance in Teyvat's history. Where did the Curse of Wilderness come from? Unlike the Curse of Immortality, which was handed down to pure-blooded Khaenri'ahns during the Cataclysm, this curse never had any distinct reason as to why it was inflicted upon Khaenri'ahns who venture above ground or are not of pure blood. All we know is that this turns humans into what we know as hilichurls roaming around. But I think this is something we could connect to a prior curse that condemned two races for separation. I am talking about the curses that the heavenly principles laid down upon both Sutervoinen and Koitar the First Angel, which subsequently cursed her entire race into becoming Seelies. At the time, Sutervoinen inhabited the body of a young boy that had distinct features of star-shaped pupils, and it would not be foolish to speculate that he might have a connection with khaenri'ah. In fact, I do think that Sutervoinen might be the founder of the Eclipse dynasty, given how the former dynasty had its own key features being the X-shaped pupils. This also implies that khaenri'ah under the Crimson Moon dynasty existed as far back as Hyperborea did. He was the one to inquire about Teyvat's forbidden origins and also suggested an overthrow of the established order. Eras later, we have the people of the Eclipse dynasty and the likes of rauthvangi fawning over the power of the Abyss, and perhaps with the foundational knowledge that developed into the study of descender beings that the Crimson Moon dynasty people have been anticipating the arrival of, this might have been a catalyst in summoning the twin to be the savior of the kingdom and the one to rule the Abyss. The moment Sutervoinen might have ventured into khaenri'ah is the pivotal moment when its dynasty started to shift, to which I propose that the transition might have happened a couple of eras back before the Archon War began. This still remains a plausible possibility given Sirtology tasking Skirk to look for his whereabouts. But if we go from a specific point in time with Sutervoinen establishing the Eclipse dynasty, it would be easier to follow the rest. This would mean that knowledge about the Descenders must have been expounded upon as time goes by. If it were to be included in areas of expertise in the Universitas Magistrorum, there would have to be a point where rauthvangi would become aware of the possible existence of Descenders. As the Universitas also had literary works, chances are Perinheri must have also been a pillar among the rest of the featured works in their collection. By the time rauthvangi spirals into deeper obsession over the abyssal power he names Elysium, he must have possessed knowledge about Descenders, or at least an idea of it. This would likely be one of the influences he brought upon the Bel-Etar, apart from the idea of rebellion and the creation of an Elysium. Still, eras before the Archon War and eras after the accidental killing of his own younger brother, the Bel-Etar must have acquired knowledge about the Descenders from rauthvangi. When the opportunity presented itself with Saaralainen wishing to marry his daughter, he might have already known the young lad's identity as a Descender, or he must have known that he could be classified as such, and thus he challenged him to a test that if he manages to open the gates of Pohjola for him, then he would grant him the blessing to receive the hand of his daughter. Unfortunately, he failed, and his fate was subjected into having his corpse cut into 7 pieces, which would then be the 7 treasures, the gnosis, for which gods of various lands would have to fight over. Looking back, I also wondered if the Elysium the Bel-Etar desired to create would be the same exact Elysium that rauthvangi obsessed over. Part of me thinks that whatever the Elysium may be, the gates of Pohjola might be of great importance to achieving this. Should it be the same as rauthvangi's Elysium, then Pohjola might be a gateway to the Abyss, and it makes a lot more sense for the Heavenly Principles to apprehend Saaralainen due to their history in dealing with such eldritch powers. Otherwise, this might present that whatever lies within Pohjola contains the likely forbidden origin of Teyvat, as Sutervoinen has inquired about. Similarly, the Heavenly Principles would apprehend Saaralainen all the same, given the parallel notion behind the 3 moon goddesses vowing not to consolidate their powers into a single body. Whatever lies within Pohjola could be the originating power that generated the loss of Teyvat, and if it were to just even be discovered by Saaralainen, a singular being that could transcend the power of gods, it would pose a huge threat for the stability of the world and its borders. This throws me back once again to khaenri'ah's continued pursuit of welcoming such a being, that since they were a nation that didn't have a god, they had to progress and thrive by themselves. Even in comparison with other ancient civilizations, at least Hyperborea had the angels coexist with them. But I just realized that there has been a deity that corresponded to khaenri'ah, the Crimson Moon. However, since the events of the War of the Funerary Flame, khaenri'ahns wouldn't realize that they've been revering a dead deity. Yet unbeknownst to this, they were able to come up with such a ceremony in welcoming Descenders which had to involve the Crimson Moon. It's just that they failed. Eras come and go, and the Crimson Moon dynasty slowly becomes shadowed by the Eclipse dynasty. But it seems that khaenri'ah never gave up on their pursuit of trying to manufacture a god of their own. And it's on the events following the Archon War and the further prosperity of the Eclipse dynasty that might answer our main concern as to why we should care now about Descenders. At present, khaenri'ah is a nation that remains destroyed, yet most of their high-ranking compatriots work on another agenda under the banner of the current cryo-archon, the Teyvat. At this point, their motive doesn't surprise me in any case that major lore revelations would be revealed. It wouldn't be much of an intrigue if it turns out that part of the Teyvat's goal stretches as continuation of what the Belitar already started. After all, both archons share the same themes of grief, and so shall be the winters that embraced Snezhnaya while echoing sentiments of rebellion and desperation. But what I like to explore here is how Snezhnaya and khaenri'ah might be a dialectic expression of the same goal that the humanity of Teyvat aims to achieve. Both shared the same resentment against the gods. Both also did have prominent figures that seek to acquire otherworldly power to enact this overthrow and claim the world for themselves. But it seems that the point in which they differ is how they see value in Descenders. khaenri'ah has many of its structural ruins scattered across Teyvat, and if you've never been to the nameless ruins in the chasm or the unknown space in Fontaine that you occasionally enter through certain locations in Elenus, you wouldn't help but pay attention to the fact that they are situated upside down. Even in some of the story quests that explore khaenri'ah, we see examples of the defiled statue being hung upside down, and this puzzled me. In the swift change of events that led to the cataclysm, how did khaenri'ah's catalog of Descenders hold up? Could it be that, similar to the Teyvat continuing the Belitar's rebellion, the Eclipse dynasty strive to continue attempts to welcome a Descender just like the Crimson Moon sages once did in Perinheri? This already is a huge possibility with how the sibling happened to be summoned in khaenri'ah by King Irmin, which contradicted the traveler's knowledge of them landing safely with the spaceship. But we also know that during the time Nahida shared with us information about the Descenders, she revealed that the sibling was not considered one and that they belonged to Teyvat. I have my suspicions that people theorizing that Teyvat might be upside down, or that the traveler and the sibling are just the same person in their relative realities, must have had valuable insights. Take a look at the word Descender. On first impression, you would come up with an idea that it involves a downward motion, a literal descent. What makes this weird is that if these beings are transcendental, wouldn't it make sense to use ascender as a more fitting label instead? Let's work with the current facts. The traveler is a descender and the sibling is not. Should we apply the concept of ascension in respect to the relative orientation of the traveler's reality, this would mean that their ascending motion would be towards the fake sky and the Sea of Stars. But remember, the Sea of Stars is where Nibelung ventured towards while leaving Teyvat in care of the Three Moons. It is from there that he also introduced the power of the Abyss to enact vengeance against the already reigning heavenly principles. If we adhere to this concept of ascension, it would invalidate the objective notion that the twins came from beyond Teyvat because the Sea of Stars would become their goal of ascension. This may still be true for the case of the traveler, but for the sibling, their motives and actions suggested that they might have been willing to stay in Teyvat for good. So the Descender logic only solidifies the actual event that there have been entities coming from beyond the world who came to Teyvat by descending motion, and as such, they would be the ones treated as gods. But here's the interesting part. Let's view things from khaenri'ah's orientation. Given their numerous inverted structures, the upside-down hanging of the defiled statue, and the weird spatial alignment as we've seen before with the sign of a Pausha in Sumeru, it would start to make sense why the sibling wasn't considered a descender. The belief of the Eclipse dynasty, especially as soon as they started welcoming abyssal powers, is that whoever gets to control the abyss controls everything. And with how the sibling stands as the throne heir to the Abyss Order, they might have figured out how to topple the established world order by the heavenly principles. I think that the sibling wasn't merely summoned into khaenri'ah, but rather khaenri'ah might have succeeded in unearthing the forbidden knowledge deep within Teyvat and began appealing to its will. And I believe that this forbidden knowledge is different from the one sought after by nibelung in Teyvat's early history. Think about it. If one of the bases for classifying someone as a descender is to verify that the irminsul has no records of them, then it should be possible to break this logic by simply inputting one's own records into irminsul. While we have no idea about the origins of irminsul, it seems to be something that is innately part of Teyvat. Perhaps it might have belonged to the dragons or any of the moons, but if one were to be associated with whatever forbidden origin Teyvat may have come from, then further association with irminsul should be inevitable, and so does the logic of their belonging to Teyvat. This might be the case for the Abyss Twin. King Irmin might have been able to summon them using the power derived from this forbidden origin. And given the siblings' prior activities to conduct the Lumafate operation, they were probably only racing with time before the traveler reaches Sumeru and comes into contact with Nahida. They needed to ensure the total destabilizing of Teyvat's entire memory before the traveler even discovered that their sibling was also once a descender. And this instability runs on a larger scale than what Nahida and Wanderer have attempted, for example in erasing Rukkhadevata and Scaramouche respectively. Then, when the Lumafate becomes completed, they can rewrite the memory in a way that separates khaenri'ah from the established logic of Teyvat. This means that with the inverted symbolisms that khaenri'ahns have incorporated in many of their structures, they establish a relative position in which they could exercise dominion by using the power of the Abyss to control everyone, descender or not. Maybe the truth of Teyvat depends on the orientation in which it is perceived, which is not entirely unlikely due to the numerous recurrence of mirror symbolism and how the traveler is often mistaken for their twin. This is their form of mockery over those who can transcend fate, and this is also a daring challenge that claims, why settle at only transcending fate when you can exert full control over it? And this might be why the sibling needs the traveler on their side as they confront the heavenly principles. What they're missing is the last piece of the puzzle that would set their inverted logic to stone, to have a descender join them and input their logic into irminsul just as the sibling was made to belong to Teyvat. However, like I said, Snezhnaya seems to mirror khaenri'ah and somewhat share the same DNA in their pursuits of overthrowing the gods, but their methods might be different, and even messier considering the possible deviation between the Teyvat and the current harbinger making it to the hot topic, Dottore. Can we prove Minsleif's theory that Dottore aims to become the fifth descender? Well, given what we discussed, it's not as simple as a yes or no. I doubt that being a descender in itself was supposed to be the goal, and I doubt it will ever be. Name some people who use that term. Piero, Nicole, Mawika, Arlecchino, Nahida, Alice, King Irmin by a stretch, and even Dottore himself. All of these names are people from fringe groups of significance. Those people happen to be ripples of legacy that khaenri'ah has been yearning for. That ever since the destruction of khaenri'ah, it's only the select few who get to keep information about the descenders. The hexenzirkel is something that comes to mind due to the mere influence of Reindotter. And the archons? Well, they always have an encounter with a fatui harbinger or two, and if it's about gnosis, these harbinger would see information about descenders as equal value. Skirk, of course, is a disciple of Sirtology. Needless to say, descenders were beings that khaenri'ahns have only been longing to welcome. Even if we trace this down to when rauthvangi and the Belly Tar are within each other's influence, we could only raise the possibility that they only seek the descender to achieve their respective Elysiums. I'm just as sure that the Teyvat aims to continue her father's goal of rebelling against the gods just as khaenri'ahns did under the Eclipse Dynasty to push their inverted world order logic. And in both cases, they would need the 7 corpse parts of the third descender and the former descender that came with the twin, respectively. So what about Dottore? What is he truly after by discovering the knowledge that the primordial laws of Teyvat that he's insinuating to be that of the Shades never belonged to the throne of heavens? We know that he and Pantalone work closely with each other over a shared ardent goal of putting humans on equal footing to that of gods. This makes him different from the Terita and the Belitar who aim to overthrow the rule of the heavenly principles, or the Eclipse dynasty who aim to place their hopes on a savior that would use the abyss to trample the heavenly order. With him burning Irminsul as a little experiment on blasphemy, it could be plausible to think that he's doing it to purge records of him in which he could then be classified as a descender. But I'd like to think of Irminsul as a limiter, a necessary bound in which humans are barred away from powers that shouldn't be in their hands. Blaspheming its existence would mean that Dottore would be blaspheming the boundary between human and god and descender and those from Teyvat, which seem to agree with his shared goal with Pantalone. He probably wouldn't care about being a descender, but what I think he's after is another power that stands on the different side of the same coin as the Abyss. The power that seems to be foreshadowed by the trilunar syzygy. The power that is capable of creating gods. The power that can radically change fate. And the power that assimilates everyone as a part of itself. And I call it Teyvat's power of unison. How could it be that Nibelung just suddenly existed alongside Teyvat when it was created? Simple answer. He was part of the same creation process. If you think about it, Nibelung was Teyvat's very first ruler. The heavenly principles usurped the authority of the dragons, created humanity, ensured that abyssal powers were suppressed, but suddenly fell into slumber at some point in history. And I think it's quite a popular misconception that they are mere tyrants. In fact, I would be more inclined to believe that they have the same foresight as Suttervoinen and decided to create humanity as a solution for Teyvat's power of unison, which aligns itself to destruction. But of course, that does not excuse them for their actions. However, I'm not leaning to the possibility that they were not about the power itself, but rather the prevention of Nibelung's rule. They probably knew the reason why the Three Moons vowed to never consolidate their powers into a single body. And if it weren't for the heavenly principles, Teyvat's power of unison might have fallen into the hands of Nibelung or Saarelainen. Even they themselves chose to not claim this power, and I could only imply that they managed to split themselves into 4 shades to interpret the division required to keep this power in check and keep the world stable. And now that Dottore is after it, he might dare to perform an experiment to test how he could go to farther lengths to elevate humanity beyond gods without knowing the risk of destruction that looms within it. The Terita is no different, as she would seek this power for vengeance just as Nibelung sought the abyss that sparked the War of the Funerary Flame. Minsleif may be right. The war has already begun and it's just a continuation of past battles. The above and below mirroring each other. Past and future seems to point fingers at one another. And so, this primordial contradiction that permeates Teyvat, it asks, why should we care about the Descenders? It's because history has already shown how it's due to them that Teyvat is always inches closer to destruction. The heavenly principles had no way to approach the threat of a single body consolidating Teyvat's forbidden origin. They settled it with war and began the messy history of Teyvat. Saarelainen was too naive to let him be tied to attachments with another and risked getting their hands on Teyvat's destructive power of unison. And now, with the Traveler, it asks them. There has been enough splitting of powers. They have been in various different domains. Would they risk becoming the likes of their twin or Dottore, or would they become the first ever successful descender to free Teyvat from its fate? Because after all, maybe Dongli was right. Maybe all that a descender needs to do is not to rule, but to witness. Maybe to also experience humanity. And only then can humanity reinforce its own realm to mediate the world's fate fettered by 2 powers of ruin. Well done, and thank you for making it to the end, analysts. I really appreciate your time watching this video. This technically makes it my very first video for the year if I don't count the shorts I've uploaded in the past few days. But you guys have been wonderful. People have started joining us from shorts, and I couldn't believe that in a span of a few weeks into the year, we managed to get this channel from 4,800 subs to now getting past the 5,000 milestone. And I'm really thankful for all the support and the reassurance just by sticking through despite my chaotic and disorganized activity here. I'm really glad that you guys show interest in some of my points, and as usual, I really like it that you guys are making the comment section an even more conducive place for discussions. That is in fact one of the community values I wanted to cultivate. Also, if you're new to my long-form videos, perhaps a new subscriber or someone who subscribed from my shorts, welcome aboard. I've got a lot of questions to cover a video about Genshin's lore and their narrative, but I occasionally also do star rails, so stay tuned to my future videos. If you find this video enjoyable, make sure to subscribe and check out some of my other videos that you might enjoy. I'm in the process of making a Discord server, so you guys could have better discussions, raise suggestions, and even just another place where we get to interact because I'm quite a Discord guy myself. And with that, I'll be seeing you in the next video. I'm Merkanique, and this is Lore and Explore. I wish you all great days ahead.